This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I have a very special guest with me tonight, an actual personal friend of mine who I opened up Slate.com last week and saw her article about Brett Kavanaugh. And the first thing I did was call her and say, will you be on my show? And she said yes. So I'm really happy to have Lisa Graves. Hi, Lisa.
Hello, hello.
And Lisa is someone who I first found out about when I was involved with Occupy. I organized a teach-in for Occupy LA, and the panel that I moderated was called The Corporatocracy. And we had people speaking about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Koch Brothers, someone from Brave New Films who did that wonderful film, The Koch Brothers Exposed. We were talking about regulatory capture of the agencies. We're talking about Citizens United. So it was at that time that I came to know Lisa's great work for an organization that she co-led, which was the Center for Media and Democracy, where she did a lot of these great investigations. Now she's started a new organization called Documented, in which they're researching corporate influence over our politics. Before that, she was the counsel for the minority leader of the Judiciary Committee when they were investigating a lot of George Bush's conservative nominees. And that was the period in which she was writing these memos, which she wrote about in Slate, and Brett Kavanaugh actually lied about them. So Lisa, why don't you tell us a little about your work for that committee, what your job was, what these memos were about, and then we'll talk about how he lied.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lauren, and hello, everyone. It's nice to see you on this platform. This is my first Facebook Live event, so thank you, Lauren, for this invitation. I was working for the Senate Judiciary Committee. I was the chief counsel for nominations for Senator Patrick Leahy. He was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee when I began that work in the beginning of 2002. And then after the midterm elections that year, the Republicans took back over the Senate and he became the ranking member. And so I worked with him and with my colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee, with the other Democratic staff on that committee from 2003 to 2004 and the beginning of 2005. So that was my role back then before I went over to do some other things with the Center for Media and Democracy, where I was the executive director, and now where I'm at Documented, where I'm the co-director, co-founder of Documented, which investigates corporate influence on our democracy.
First of all, what was your work? You were researching these conservative nominees of George Bush, Estrada and Owen. Tell us about them and what you found out about them and why you thought they were such extremists.
I was the chief counsel for nominations, and so we had a team working for the ranking member and the chairman and assisting the other offices on the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Democrats, on evaluating the nominees that President George W. Bush had made to the United States courts, including the courts of appeals as well as the district courts. And that process involved evaluating their record, looking through what was on the surface of the record from the Senate questionnaire, as well as what was available in the public about that person's background, their record. And a number of the circuit court nominees who were nominated by President Bush really had records of extreme views, of an agenda for the courts to move it very far to the right. And some of them had what I would describe as records of unfairness. And there are many of them that I could talk with you about. In the case of Miguel Estrada, he was someone who was quite young and he was being promoted to the DC Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. And he had a reputation in Washington as someone who had some, very strong, sort of very right-wing views on a lot of different policies from his time at the Justice Department and beyond. And he was someone who was nominated in the beginning of 2001, and the Senate had a hearing on his nomination and had requested his memos from his time at the Justice Department. And there was ample precedent from history in other nominations for requesting those memos, but the Bush administration refused to provide even a single memo relating to Miguel Estrada's nomination from his time at the Justice Department. So that was the primary issue before Congress at that time, before the Senate, was that fact, the fact that the Bush administration refused to provide any of his memoranda. With respect to Justice Priscilla Owen, she was on the Texas Supreme Court, and she had a very controversial record there, and in particular on a number of issues that many Americans were writing in about, including specifically her views on choice, on abortion, and her role in a case involving the judicial bypass procedure for a minor to get an abortion to protect her, her own decision about her destiny. And so she was a very controversial nominee, but there were many others. There was a judge who was tough on all criminal defendants convicted, except for really in the case of a couple white guys who were convicted of cross burning, burning a cross on the lawn of a black family. Then he showed extraordinary leniency, and he had other very troubling things in his record, including the idea that if you receive a right to sue letter in an equal employment opportunity case, you receive a letter from the government so that you can sue in federal court, that meant your case had no merit. It was shocking. There were other substantial troubles with his nomination, and there were many others who had records of unfairness. And I would say that to you because, this question of who should be on our courts, who should be a judge, is fundamentally a question of fairness. There are a lot of smart people out there. I'm sure you know a lot of smart people. Being smart isn't the same as being fair. In fact, a lot of smart people can be very closed-minded, very narrow, and even arrogant. They may have, very strong views, and they may believe they're right, and they may have a strong desire to make other people bend to their will, in essence. And so, being smart is important for being a judge, obviously, but being fair and smart is incredibly important, because these are not just a short-term judgeship where you're elected in a city or county for a couple of years and then you face re-election if you don't prove to have the temperament, the wisdom to be a judge. This is not that situation. This is a lifetime appointment to the federal courts. And George W. Bush and the team of lawyers in his White House counsel's office were choosing very young people in their late 30s, early 40s for these circuit court, appellate court appointments, people who would potentially serve on those courts for 10, 20, 30, 40, perhaps even 50 years as judges. And so it's very significant to entrust someone who's only been practicing law for perhaps 11 years or 12 years or even 15 years, or maybe they weren't really practicing law, litigation before the courts. They were a political operative. They were active in very partisan activities, and yet they were being rewarded with a lifetime opportunity to rule in cases affecting millions and millions of Americans. And so we on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff took our job very seriously to try to evaluate the records of those nominees and provide the best advice that we could to the members of that committee and the Senate about whether those nominees should be given this privilege of a lifetime job as a judge on our courts, ruling on cases affecting Americans for decades to come.
Okay, let me ask you about those judges. Were they all members of the Federalist Society? Yes or no?
Many of them were. In fact, we put in the record, I believe in 2003, examples of how some of the most extreme of those nominees were either past members of the Federalist Society or had not been, quote, members, but were active at Federalist Society events. And so they were active in an organization that has been described as a debating society. And in fact, it's an organization that has been spent decades now trying to move the law further and further to the far right. And also particularly on corporate issues to really embrace a very corporate, pro-corporation view of the law.
Well, that's Kavanaugh for sure. And I want for the viewers who don't know about the Federalist Society, because it's been a very important part of the whole right-wing program to take over the media, to take over the universities, to take over the think tank, to have lobby groups. If you watch my friend Donald Goldmacher's film Heist, Who Stole the American Dream, you'll see this all laid out in the Powell memo. And so we're talking about the judiciary in this program today. How many of those extreme nominees, would you say percentage-wise, Bush was able to get approved?
Well, I don't know that figure off the top of my head, but what I know is that at a certain point in 2003, in November of 2003, the Judiciary Committee, the Democrats of the Judiciary Committee had made a determination, in essence, to approve a lot of George Bush's nominees, hundreds of them, in fact. I think it was nearly 200 at that point. And only a handful had been blocked on the floor of the United States Senate. And so at that point, I believe that the statistic was that 98.6% of the judicial nominees that were brought to a vote on the floor of the United States Senate have been approved. And a handful, the most extreme of those nominees, were being blocked. And the White House, the Bush White House, was attacking Democrats relentlessly as obstructionists. And in fact, the Bush White House at that time, we heard that the Bush White House had given the staff on the floor of the Senate buttons that said 100%. They believed that they were entitled to 100% of their nominees to be confirmed, regardless of the concerns that were raised by citizens across the country, whether they were members of the civil rights community, people who were deeply concerned about the environment, women and men who are concerned about women's reproductive health and their destinies and their future. And there was an array of citizens across the country who were very worried about some of these judges. It didn't matter what the concern was. It was the view of the Bush administration that George W. Bush, notwithstanding the circumstances of his taking the role of president in terms of the loss of the popular vote and the decision in Bush v. Gore that has been so widely condemned, it was their position that he was entitled to have 100% of what he wanted, and even 1.4% not getting those was a war for them.
Well, before we talk about Kavanaugh and his whole role in this and how he lied repeatedly, I want to ask your opinion about the Democrats on this, because you just told me something I didn't know, that they approved most of his judges. And we know that Schumer recently approved a lot of Trump's lower court judges, and a lot of progressives on the left end. I'm not even in the Democratic Party anymore, but a lot of people on the left feel that the Democrats keep caving over and over, and that they should have, opposed more of Bush's nominees. They should have opposed Trump's nominees, and they should have fought harder for Obama's nominees, including Merrick Garland. In fact, that he shouldn't even have appointed a centrist like Merrick Garland, because he wasn't anyone that the base could get excited about. So before we talk about Brett Kavanaugh, what is your personal opinion on the Democrats and the way they act, with these judicial nominees, whether they're in power or not?
Well, I think it's hard. It's sort of hard to really assess this in some ways, because you have a situation with the courts where there are so many vacancies that have come up. And there has been a lot of the Democrats have a strong desire to have those courts have judges in them, and are uncomfortable with the idea of blocking them all. That's one of the differences in some ways between the parties, notwithstanding the criticism of both parties that criticism have been made. But in some ways, what you see is Democrats who want to have a system that they believe works, and where courts are filled, and where the judicial administration continues, and they tend to be in general uncomfortable with being called obstructionist, of obstructing things. They want to create things, I suppose. In some ways, that's one way of viewing it. Whereas the Republican Party, has tended, particularly in nominations, to take a view that it will obstruct anyone that they wish, whenever they wish, and that dynamic between the parties in terms of this desire to have sort of government functioning versus this desire this willingness to let it just completely break if someone doesn't get their way. That's a really significant difference in which the way both parties approach these issues. But I would say, in terms of this recent situation, the reality is that it's very difficult for Senator Schumer, for the Democratic leader in the Senate, to block that many nominees, in part because they don't have the filibuster anymore. The period in which I'm talking with you about is the period in which we had the filibuster for judicial nominees, and it was used in essence sparingly in the cases where the caucus as a whole was persuaded that a particular person should not be entrusted with that lifetime position on the bench. It's a lot of work to persuade members, and especially when they're being assailed by all of these, attack ads and the like, to block someone. But in the case in my period of work, we had the filibuster, and so we had options, tactical options that Senator Schumer doesn't have. Now, there are other tactical options, I'm sure, besides the filibuster, and I'm sure many of those are being explored, although I don't know I don't have insight into that part of the process. But I think that the situation with these recent circuit court nominees, it's very difficult for them to block them with the procedures in the Senate. And so I think that it's easy to say block them. And in fact, I think it may very well be warranted in many circumstances to say that if the people have a record of unfairness. But, actually making it stick at this point in the session, when there's still many more session days before Congress recesses, when Democrats don't have control of the recess schedule, they don't have control of the floor schedule. There's processes for unanimous consent or withholding unanimous consent. But it's actually a more procedurally complex process than it appears on the surface of just say no.
Yeah.
So, I'm not only an apologist, but the reality is that I believe that there are very, very good members, senators who care very much about the courts and about the process, but who also don't have the same view as some of the Republicans of just a total blockade. They have a different view of government, and they also have a different view of how the process should work for nominations.
Well, they're being reasonable, and they're always being reasonable, and that's the problem. I mean, we haven't had a functioning government, in my mind, since, Newt Gingrich started this whole thing with his contract for America, which should have been called a contract on America, in my opinion, where he just became very obstructionist and wasn't working with the opposing side. And Frank Luntz was his pollster and writing that whole playbook for him. And I think that's where the bipartisanship fell apart, in my view of history, am I remembering it contemporaneously. But getting back to Kavanaugh, so what was Kavanaugh's role for the Bush White House when you were writing these memos? And tell us what happened with this guy, Miranda, how he got the memos to Kavanaugh and how Kavanaugh lied about them, specifically in 2004 and 2006.
At that time, between January 21st, 20th, really, 2001 until the summer of 2003, Brett Kavanaugh was an associate White House counsel and a leader within the White House counsel's office of their team on a variety of issues, working with Alberto Gonzalez. I think that they had between 9 and 10 attorneys at any given time who were in the White House counsel's office as associate counsels or in a senior role. And he played a central role in the nomination process and the selection process on a number of nominees and in the overall work of the White House in trying to push these nominees through as a whole, as well as in individual circumstances. And so his role was to help the White House attack the Democrats, in essence, if they weren't getting the judges confirmed. And his role was also to help choose them, many of them himself with other lawyers, as well as helping them get through the hearing process. And so nominations wasn't the only thing he did, but it was a substantial part of the work he did. And then in mid-2003, he was nominated to a seat on the D.C. Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And around that same time, his job changed. He became the staff secretary for the White House, a job that he held until he was confirmed subsequently in 2006 to that judgeship. So he was someone who was at first in that time frame a counsel working on nominations, then briefly staff secretary while he was nominated in the first part. Then he testified in his nomination hearing in 2004. He didn't make it through. He came back up, was renominated in 2005, still staff secretary. And in 2006, he had another hearing in which he was asked about these issues. And then he was confirmed by a Republican-controlled Senate that had a larger majority control.
Now, who was Miranda, and how do you suppose he got a hold of these emails?
Well, Manuel Miranda was someone who was hired by Senator Orrin Hatch when Senator Orrin Hatch was the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Miranda was hired as counsel in December of 2001, and he worked in that capacity for Orrin Hatch from December of 2001 until approximately January of 2003. In January of 2003, he became the primary counsel for Senator Bill Frist on nomination. Senator Bill Frist had become the majority leader after that midterm election. And so Manny Miranda's role on the Senate Judiciary Committee with Hatch was working on nominations and trying to help get these nominees through their hearings and get them confirmed. And his role with Senator, and he was working with, as part of a team with the White House and with outside right-wing groups to try to do that. And then when he moved over to Senator Frist's office, left the Senate Judiciary Committee, he was working in a leadership role on behalf of the Republicans in the Senate to try to push these nominees through during that period when we were working on the Democratic side to filibuster some of the most controversial nominees. And so he was in the heart of that battle, working closely with Brett Kavanaugh and some other lawyers in the White House and the Justice Department, as well as with these outside groups, including Committee for Justice, which was created that year by C. Boyd and Gray, who's someone who's been involved in a lot of extreme policies and activities. He's the person who's sort of famous or infamous for being George Herbert Walker Bush's White House counsel, so the first President Bush's White House counsel. And he helped put Justice Souter from the New Hampshire Supreme Court on the U.S. Supreme Court, which was widely condemned by the right wing because he was someone who was moderate. And they sort of vowed after Justice Souter that they would never make that mistake again. And C. Boyd and Gray has worked extensively since that time period, since the early 1990s, to try to, help put as many right-wing judges on the courts as possible, to have no more suitors is sort of their phrase. And so that was the role that Manny Miranda had. He was the primary lawyer on judicial nominations for the majority leader in the United States Senate for Senator Bill Frist. And his job was to try to ram these judges through that Democrats had raised sincere and deep concerns about.
Now, how do you suppose he got a hold of those memos that you wrote?
Well, there was actually an investigation of it in November of 2003. This was shortly after Brett Kavanaugh moved over from the nominations work directly in the White House counsel's office to being the staff secretary. So in November of 2003, Manny Miranda had helped orchestrate what they were calling a round-the-clock debate over judicial nominees to try to break the filibusters of the Democrats. They scheduled 2 days of debate, round the clock, and they were working to have a big sort of press showing. Some of the outside groups were having people bust in to watch the proceedings on the floor. They had all these talking points to try to attack the Democrats, and they had the 100% buttons, on their lapels. And in the process of preparing for that, this is actually an interesting story, I suppose. I'm sure your listeners might be interested in it, but Manny Miranda sent out an email the day that those debates, that the floor debate was supposed to begin in the evening, basically telling all of the Senate Republicans to end Senate business so that the Republicans in the Senate, senators, could march into the U.S. Senate chamber to coincide with Fox Evening News' opening broadcast at 6 p.m. Eastern. And some Republican senators, that email apparently went to Republican Senate offices. Some Republican senators were so upset by this idea, that that the Senate business, the business of the United States Senate, would be subjugated to a nightly newscast for stage managing, that one of those Republican senators gave that email to another senator, a Democratic senator, because it was just so outrageous that would happen. And Senator Durbin went to the floor to talk about that, to talk about this idea that this whole thing was orchestrated, that the Senate's business would be subverted to a Fox News newscast. And apparently that enraged Manny Miranda, and he either directly or through one of his agents gave a set of memos that he had been stealing, in my view, from the United States Senate. He gave them to the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And so the next morning, after working on the floor overnight, helping to staff these senators speaking 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, the next morning we woke up to an editorial that included excerpts of some of the memos, private confidential memos of Democratic staff working for the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that weekend, the Senate Sergeant at Arms was called to investigate this theft. They cordoned off the servers with crime tape to restrict access to them. That following week, more memos had come out in through right-wing groups or in right-wing outlets, excerpts of them. And Senator Hatch, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, ordered an investigation that month. He suspended one of his staffers, and he asked the Senate Sergeant at Arms, whose name is William Pickle. He was a Republican who was appointed by Republican Bill Frist to that role. He's had an experience in law enforcement, and he was tasked with finding out how the Senate's documents were taken that way, how they were stolen and distributed. And he was tasked also with funding to have a forensic analysis of the servers and computers on the Judiciary Committee to find out what happened. And so there was nearly a 3.5-month investigation into that. It turned out that Manuel Miranda and Jason Lindell, who was working in Hatch's staff, had taken more than 4,000 documents, predominantly from the Democratic staff of the Senate Judiciary Committee, myself included, and that they had done so without authorization, that they had done so secretly. But that was the information that was available as part of in essence, a voluntary investigation in which there was not subpoena power for Sergeant at Arms Pickle. And so when the Sergeant at Arms and his investigators asked Manny Miranda who he was working with at the White House on these matters, who were his legislative contacts, judicial contacts on these matters, he refused to tell them the names of the people he was working with, because presumably they would be the people who would be benefiting from this theft, from these memos about the strategies, substantive concerns, tactics, and talking points, speeches, drafts, and the like. And so he refused to say so. And in March of 2004, the Sergeant at Arms issued a report to the Judiciary Committee that recommended that that these issues be referred to the Justice Department, to the U.S. Attorney's Office for investigation for potential federal crimes committed that were committed potentially at that time in that investigation, as part of the investigation by Miranda and Lindell. Of course, that was the Bush administration which was determined to get its judges through, and it did not prosecute the men who were directly named in that Senate report. And the very next month is when Brett Kavanaugh came before the Senate for the first hearing on his nomination to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Okay,
so he lied twice about whether he saw these memos, and something was released. Emails were released by Leahy last week before his hearings, in which it proved that he did know. So why don't you tell us what he said about it at this point and why it is so incredulous to you?
Well, he was asked more than 100 questions about this matter, about this issue of the theft of these files, what he knew, when he knew it, whether he'd seen anything that was suspicious, whether he had, I'm paraphrasing, obviously there's direct text and quotes. Senator Hatch asked him about whether he had seen any drafts or talking points or heard any reference to anything that might be the files of from the files of the Democratic staff on these issues. He said no, he had not ever seen any such materials. He said that in that hearing, he said the same thing and similar things in the other hearings. And then this past week, for the very, very first time, members of that Senate Judiciary Committee who had asked those questions saw with their own eyes, although I think because some of it was committee confidential, they may have seen it the week before, but the public saw for the very first time that that he had lied, that there was evidence that he had lied, that there were, in fact, talking points directly pasted into emails that Brett Kavanaugh had received from Manuel Miranda, that there were documents described as confidential letters that were provided by the Senator Leahy's staff to Democratic counsel, described that way. And then though Miranda says he doesn't have the letter, he then discloses the contents of the letter, key contents of the letter, really a not credible assertion given what he was conveying, and other details that could only have come from inside information from Democratic staffers. And so, the fact that he received those at the time, I believe that he would know that was information that he was not entitled to, that no Democrat on that committee in this incredibly pitched battle over judicial nominations would ever have given him that information, would not have given that to Republicans, would not have given that to Manny Miranda in the height of these fights where Republicans were calling Democrats anti-woman, anti-Catholic, anti-white Southern male, anti-Latino, you name it, they were attacking the Democrats. But Kavanaugh was getting a range of material. Now, we only know that from a small sampling of the the emails that have been released. This White House, the Bush library, basically through a Republican who is screening those documents, who is a friend of Brett Kavanaugh's. It has only released a small portion of those, and has the Bush administration and the administration has asserted blanket executive privilege over more than 100,000 additional pages. And they bypassed the traditional process for the National Archive Records Act, NARA, which is how these records are supposed to be processed by the professional archivists. And there is obviously some review by libraries, presidential libraries in that process. But there's a deliberative process. There's privilege logs. If there is a privilege that's asserted, really targeted redaction if it's necessary to preserve a legitimate privilege. In this instance, you have this wholesale blocking of turning over records that the Senate is entitled to have, that the American people are entitled to have, to know about this nominee and his true record, because what the emails that were revealed so far show is that he has hidden and concealed his true record, and that he lied directly to the faces of both the Republicans and the Democrats on that Senate Judiciary Committee. And I think that what we saw last week for the first time was evidence that in those hearings in 2004 and 2006, that he was not honest with the committee, that he was dishonest, that he lied under oath repeatedly. And I think that calls for a full investigation and not his elevation.
Right. Now, you were saying that he tried to say that it was a matter of course that those memos would be shared with him once he got found out. But that, of course, is ridiculous, because why would you share those memos with the opposition when you're trying to defeat the opposition? So you think that he should be impeached from the judiciary. The question is, do you think he's going to get confirmed? Because I do. Everybody's placing their hopes in Murkowski and Collins. And quite frankly, they've already confirmed Gorsuch, and I don't think they're going to break. I think he's going to be confirmed. Now, so my next question is, could a Supreme Court justice be impeached for perjury?
Well, I was going to say, if I could respond to your to the question or statement you just made, Lauren, I believe, and I believe throughout my career when I was in government and since I left government, that it's absolutely essential for people to speak out and speak the truth about these issues, about our courts, about fair courts. And, it's not just a policy debate. It's not just a bill. It's a question of our future with this Supreme Court. This court will be ruling on whether we as a people have the capacity, have the legal tools to address the climate changes that are underway, that are harming our planet, harming our people, harming our communities right now, and whether even with the will of the people to address those serious this serious threat to our future as a people, as human beings on this planet, whether we have the whether we can actually pass laws to do so. This court will make rulings for perhaps, the next, if he is confirmed, and depending on, what happens down the road, decades of law about women's reproductive rights, decades of law about whether we, the people, are the masters of corporations or whether corporations are the masters of us, whether we have the ability to regulate corporations, or whether corporations, their religious views, as with the Hobby Lobby case, trump the religious views or the actual individual rights of actual human beings, ordinary persons, ordinary people, whether we'll have employment laws that protect equal rights in this country, whether we'll even have safe workplaces, whether the Occupational Safety and Health Act can be fully enforced to protect workers. And so this is an issue where the courts have a dramatic role long after any single president is in office. And I believe that I know there's always, people talking about what's going to happen, who's going to vote what way. I believe that the imperative is to speak forcefully about the truth. That's always what I did when I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, to tell the story about these nominees and what their records showed, and make that case to each senator, not assume how they're going to vote, but individually, myself, if I could, or colleagues, to talk with them heart to heart about what was at stake, and about heart to heart about the real life, real world impact of their vote on judicial nominations.
Okay, you didn't answer my question. I totally agree with you that we have to speak out and we have to make it known, but it also has to do with what journalists are doing, which is going to lead me to my next set of questions about what you have done as a journalist with Center for Media and Democracy, with exposing the Koch brothers and Alec, with your new publication, Documented.
Lauren, I'm totally happy to answer your question, but I want to address this question of, like, we're doomed. I haven't given up the fight, and I don't think anyone else should. Until that vote happens, I don't think anyone should give up.
Well, the problem is that the people that are protesting in Washington, D.C. have made it about, yet again, a single issue, and that's Roe versus Wade. It wasn't until Democracy Now! Last week did their report on all the panoply of issues that you just brought up that showed how dangerous he would be. So now when you focus on one issue, if you don't care about choice, you're not going to be, that enthused about calling your representative to vote against him. So this is, again, the function of the media. And I want to ask you about your work doing that. But I first wanted you to answer my question as to, if he becomes the Supreme Court justice and the Democrats get control, can they initiate impeachment hearings of a Supreme Court justice?
Yes, it's certainly the case. There's historical precedent for those investigations, including for perjury. It would be in the hands of the United States House of Representatives to begin any such proceeding, to begin an investigation. It's possible that there could be an appointment of a special counsel, although I would imagine that would be something that this administration would be disinclined to do, given the absurd and outlandish attacks that have been made on the current special counsel. But there are steps that people can take, that members can take, to further investigate this issue and other issues that are in the public interest. And so It's certainly possible that there could be an investigation further into these matters. I know that there are groups that are have been actively trying to get the records through the National Archive Records Act process and from the Presidential Library. There's litigation going on about that. There'll be litigation about those documents, I'm sure. And so there are a number of things that will be happening in the years ahead, regardless of what happens in the vote on this nomination. But I would say to you, I don't want to discount your perception in terms of choice and the activists who've been speaking about choice. But I know that there are numerous public interest groups that represent, millions of people who care about our environment, who care about civil rights, and they have been. I know from the letters and the testimony on Friday before the Senate Judiciary Committee that there are a lot of issues that have been raised through those constituencies, through those groups, to members. But I take your point in terms of media focus, what the media may be focusing on in terms of protesters speaking out within the hearing or speaking up during the hearing, and that focus. But there actually has been, I think, a lot of effort by a lot of people who care deeply about this to try to raise the alarm and wake people up about this nominee.
Well, I think the only thing that's going to work is that ploy that Addie Barkin set up, which is that fund to replace Susan Collins if she votes yes. And that fund already has, I think, $500,000 in it from people. Now, they don't have to give unless she votes yes, but once she votes yes, it's triggered. And I think that's a brilliant strategy because we're always talking about how there are going to be consequences for votes, and then we never come through. When I say we, I mean we on the left. There were people actually in her office, and they could see that the interns were not writing down the comments. In fact, people were starting to call and say, read back to me what I just said, and they were unable to do it. So it makes one very cynical about government and how representative these people are, or I should say how responsive they are to their constituents. But again, getting back to the media, because I know that you have to do another show at the top of the hour, I wanted to talk about the body of your work for your lifetime, because it's been so singularly focused on corporations and how they influence our government. Why don't you tell us about some of the things that you were most proud of doing at Center for Media and Democracy, and also what you're currently working on, some of the investigations at Documented?
Oh, thank you, Lauren. Well, the work that we've done at CMD when I was the executive director, and also as the work continues at CMD, I think that we've done a tremendous amount of so I lost my train of thought there. Sorry about that, but I believe we've done a tremendous amount of work to really open people's eyes to things. I think that we were certainly one of the first investigative groups that was really looking closely at the Koch brothers in 2009 and 2010. In fact, the first article that I wrote for the Center for Media Democracy for PR Watch was about Freedom Works and the AstroTurf campaign that was being launched to attack efforts to reform healthcare, to try to get single payer, and to try to attack Democrats for even having healthcare reform as an agenda item. And so, I think we really helped begin part of the more recent conversation about the Kochs. There have been times in the past, sort of pre-Google, where the Kochs came into the news for a moment and then were out of the news. But we did a lot of early work on the Kochs in 2009, 2010. Obviously, Jane Mayer's article in 2010, her own research, not ours, but her article really just opened so many people's eyes. And then we continued to work on those some of those revelations and other revelations that we uncovered in part through our investigations. And in 2011, a whistleblower came to me with documents that showed that, much to my shock, quite frankly, that state legislators were actually voting as equals with corporate lobbyists on bills before they were introduced in our state houses through a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, a group that very few people had heard of before we launched the ALEC Exposed investigation. There was early work on ALEC in 1998, 99 by the National Education Association. They were seeing They were seeing the activities of ALEC, but they, couldn't get much traction in the press about what ALEC was, and they didn't have details that we had about the voting by these corporations with legislators. And there were other groups as well in the early 2000s, but until we were able to prove that, in fact, corporate lobbyists were voting as equals with these legislators behind closed doors without the press or public present on bills in every area, bills about whether you could sue if a corporation's actions hurt you or your family or kill a family member, rules about the workplace, whether you have safety rules, rules to try to privatize, laws to try to privatize our schools, our prisons, try to privatize anything that isn't nailed down, and some things that are, changing the rules for workers and the workplace and more. And so that work in 2011 really helped open up a conversation nationally that has grown over the last 7 years about this influence of these corporations in our states through ALEC. And so I'm certainly proud of that work by CMD and the team, and also the broader coalition. That coalition included Color of Change, People for the American Way, Common Cause, Greenpeace, and more, who were really reaching out to the members to tell them about this extraordinary circumstance around these bills and the really controversial measures, including gun bills and more. In fact, there have been a couple documentaries about it. Bill Moyers did a documentary, United States of ALEC, that helped tell that story. There was a tremendous set of work that was in the movie The 13th that won, was nominated for an Academy Award and won other significant awards as a documentary. That was a tremendous film. And in this most recent series that's been airing on Paramount and BET, Rest in Power, Trayvon Martin, they don't tell the story of ALEC specifically, but they tell the story of a bill that ALEC took up, the so-called Stand Your Ground law in Florida. And that, was a bill that was initiated by the National Rifle Association that was then taken to an ALEC meeting, a closed-door meeting, where Walmart and other corporations voted to try to make that bill a national model. Walmart has since left ALEC, but that's not all ALEC did. ALEC also pushed for measures to make it harder for Americans to vote through these voter ID restrictions and more. And so those stories have really, I think the work we did, the work that our friends and colleagues in the media across the country have really helped open a lot of people's eyes and helped change the conversation to one in which how should our democracy work? That's not how our democracy should work.
Yeah, well, I remember ALEC, some of the early reporting was that some of these Republican legislators wouldn't even put it on their own stationery. They would introduce the bill directly on ALEC stationery. And they were also behind the Papers, Please law that Joe Arpaio used. And they were behind the executive emergency manager. Yes, the emergency manager that so many of these Republicans are putting in to take over these towns. Rachel Maddow, before she went all Russiagate on us, did some great reporting on Benton Harbor. And I think that was also in Wisconsin, wasn't it? Because it's where Kohler has their headquarters.
No, Benton Harbor is in Michigan.
Yeah.
But and someday you and I will have to have a separate conversation about the merits of the Russia investigation. I think it's very substantive and real and extremely serious for our national security. But that's for another time. I know we don't have the same view on that.
But I do want to talk about documented because, I perused your website and I see that you're doing stuff on Ryan Zinke and who he's having meetings with. He's head of the Interior Department. And recently I posted an article on Facebook that all 15 executive agencies have been captured by people who either worked in the industry that they're supposed to be regulating or are hell-bent on, either eliminating the agency, getting rid of regulations, not enforcing regulations. And it's a terrible, terrible situation. And our corporate media really isn't spending a lot of time focusing on this because they want to focus on the personalities and the horse race and the things that are controversial in terms of personalities, but not in terms of what's really going to be affecting the American people. And so I wanted to ask you a question. Your organization is funded by individual donations, by foundation grants, and every organization that I know, every NGO that's funded that way, always has to go begging to the public. Do you think that with the crisis in journalism, with so many newspapers shutting down, so many cities losing, a second newspaper, and now even a first newspaper, with them shutting down investigative bureaus, them shutting down local bureaus, city hall bureaus, foreign bureaus, and the real crisis that we have in journalism, do you think that good investigative journalism should be publicly funded in this country?
Well, I think that there's certainly precedent even in the United States for government funding and support for the media. Some of the earliest legislation on this matter, as Bob McChesney and John Nichols have documented in their books, some of the earliest legislation in our country was about ensuring that there was a functioning press in the United States in terms of the price of mailing pamphlets and media. And so there's an early precedent in our own country for the idea that is at the core in some ways of our democracy, which is that you need to have an informed public in order to have a well-functioning democracy. There's also been support in the modern era that has been, attacked for public broadcasting as a non-commercial way to provide people with information that isn't just about selling products. And so there's that in the United States. And in other countries, the public media is much more robustly funded and supported. And that doesn't mean that it's without difficulties from time to time. But in the United States, what we've seen even on National Public Radio, but particularly on public TV, is that the right wingers have tried to gut the funding for public television, which has required them to seek money from the Koch brothers, for example. Not that they're required, but they have accepted money from the Koch brothers and others to underwrite their broadcasts. And there's certainly a story there about one of the movies about the Koch brothers with one of the state public television outlets, and whether they were going to show a story that was critical about the Koch brothers because the Koch brothers were such funders. Or in that case, David Koch was a major funder.
He was on the board of WGBH, as a matter of fact, and I remember the protest to try to get him to step down from the board. Now, he may be suffering with his cancer may have reoccurred. I'm not really sure, because he made a very prominent announcement this summer that he was stepping down from his political role. Yet one of your investigations shows that they're actually injecting more money into these midterms. Before we go, and I know you have to go, do you want to just wrap up with telling us about those nefarious Koch brothers and what they're up to now, and what, if anything, we in the public can do about it?
Well, we know that at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, the Koch brothers have made a big investment they basically corralled money from their billionaire buddies to help run major ads in this midterm on both the elections at the federal level as well as in the states, and also on judicial nominations, on the possibility that the rest of us thought was a possibility of a Supreme Court vacancy. And so they plan to spend hundreds of millions of dollars that they have either partly contributed to, and their billionaire brothers have and sisters have contributed to try to distort the outcome of this election, to try to overcome the public sentiment, the growing public sentiment that the country's on the wrong track, and that there need to be checks and balances on this president and on his policies. And so their money is starting to be spent now. You'll be seeing it in your states. You'll get door knockers, knocking on your doors with door hangers. You'll see Facebook ads. You'll see TV ads. You could get calls as well. And a lot of times the Kochs don't operate under their own name. They don't say this is Charles Koch trying to distort your view, to try to change your vote, to advance his very right-wing extreme view of the world. Instead, they create these little pop-up groups that have friendly names of people for this or citizens for that, or
Americans for Prosperity.
Americans for Prosperity, which I always think should be called Americans for Greed, that didn't poll as well as prosperity, but that's their, I think, true name in my view. And so, you know, when you see those groups pop up with those ads, usually they'll run attack ads, and they'll run ads sometimes just saying call your member, not saying vote yes or no, but clearly it's designed to attack that person before the election. They've spent millions before. This is their long-standing practice, and they are investing heavily in trying to preserve a Koch majority in the United States Senate and a Koch majority in the United States House, and a Koch majority, in essence, to enact their agenda through the United States Supreme Court.
So there's really nothing we as individuals can do about them except stay vigilant and try to figure out who are the Koch brothers candidates and what their real agenda is. You know, we need better journalism in this country. We also need a better education system that's currently in the process of being privatized. And I want to thank you very much. And I put your website up on the screen so that people can go there, read some of your wonderful investigations, maybe get on your mailing list or make a donation. But thank you so much, Lisa, for being on the show. And thank you for all your great work.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for having me on. And I know you said that something about like how do we beat them? They've got so much money, but you know, we outnumber them. People who are concerned about these extreme policies, this extreme privatization agenda, and more, we outnumber them. And people need to be talking to their friends and family and coworkers and colleagues about the future of our country and how the country we want to see we want to see for ourselves and for our future in terms of our environment, our workplaces, our families, and our communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
All right. So, folks, that was Lisa Graves, and she is the executive director of Documented. And that is a wonderful website that I've been putting on the screen, and I will put in the comments, where you can read all of her wonderful investigations about how corporations are trying to influence our government and our politics. So thank you very much. Have a great evening and keep fighting.